everybody. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Spirit Lake Presbyterian Church. My name is Dan Kohler. I'm the pastor here, and it's really great to see all of you today. We're really happy to be able to bring you Shaun and all the wonderful knowledge he has about the past, the history of this area. And what better setting to have an event like this about the history of our area and our ancestors than in a historic structure like this. So with that, I will go ahead. And just to let everyone know, a cheap plug for our church, of course. We have Sunday services at 9 a.m. Every week, and so contrary to popular belief, we are not an abandoned building. We are active, very much so, and you are always welcome every Sunday at 9 a.m. And with that, let me just, since this is a house of the Lord, I'll just bring us to a brief word of prayer real quick. If you'll bow your heads. Lord, we thank you for gathering us this afternoon. We thank you for the wonderful things we will learn about. May we be so inspired that as we learn about the people who laid the foundations for this place that we call home, that we may be so inspired to live lives that set the foundations for the generations that will come after us in this place. We ask you for this and thank you for this in your holy name, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. And I'll hand it over to Brad to introduce Shaun.
So I'm Brad Sundahl from the Historical Society, and I was listening to a meeting of the Native Plant Society in Sandpoint on a Zoom meeting, and they had the camera pointed at the ceiling, so I couldn't even see the guy talking, but the guy was Shaun. And I thought, this guy knows all kinds of stuff that we could really use in our community about this area and its history. And then when you see what he's brought along, I mean, I'm blown away at, and as he'll tell you, he made most of this stuff up here. It isn't museum stuff except for his museum quality reproduction. Anyway, so the Historical Society, we've gotten some materials. Over 100 years ago, there was a women's club that started meeting as soon as the town was set up. And that women's club, they had talks about the geology, the history of the area on a regular basis. And we kind of like to reestablish a setting where people could have learned things about the community, enjoy music together as we have done here in this church, not only in the church itself, but in some of the concerts we've had in the last year. So this is our first attempt at a historical talk, and it's a free presentation. The Historical Society is paying him to come here, but both the Historical Society and the church do rely on donations. We do take donations, and afterwards we have some brochures that you can fill in if you want to join the Historical Society, and the cost is nothing. You just have to give us your name and information, and we do appreciate any donations, but you'll get on our email mailing list for future events like this. And Shaun has got a bunch of cards in case you know of some other group or have some interest in his art or the work that he has for sale. And they'll both be available back here in the social hall where there's coffee and cookies afterwards. And I'm told this can go up to an hour and a half, he says, to get everything covered. So be patient and enjoy the talk.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the mic loud enough? Yeah. Okay. Hopefully it doesn't start to squeak on me too. So yeah, my name is Shaun. I live up in Priest River. Grew up in Pennsylvania originally. Came out west in like 2003, and ended up in Priest River because my in-laws who are here today with my two boys, they live in Spokane, so we love the area up here. I guess to give you a little bit of background, how I got an interest in this was that I've always been into the outdoors and doing things like backpacking and mountain biking and being out in nature. And at some point I started to want to learn how to be out there and not rely on things in my backpack, but how you could like feed yourself with what you hunted or gathered, how you would build shelter from natural materials, all of those survival skills. And through beginning to learn about that stuff, I got involved with a lot of people who do these primitive living skills gatherings around the country. Closest one that happens to us is up in Valley, Washington every spring. And people will get together for a week and teach all sorts of traditional skills. They might be doing basketry, hide tanning, how to make stone tools, a lot of the kind of things, that you see here that I do. So my interest in that, though, was not to just do those crafts, but how to put them in the context of history, and specifically the history of the place where I live. And so that's what got me interested in the era of the fur trade. And when I was living down in Oregon at one point in my 20s and early 30s, I was involved with a group down there that would do living history events at a place called Shampooey State Park, where it was a Hudson's Bay place, a place where the people from Fort Vancouver that worked for Hudson's Bay Company would stop over there. And that when I moved to this area, then I got involved with a group that does living history at the Spokane House Interpretive Center in Riverside State Park. That's our kind of real site of interest here that we have within like a 50-mile radius or so that gives us a real window into that time period, because there was a fur trade fort built there. And prior to that, it was a massive fishing village for the Spokane people at the junction of the Spokane and Little Spokane rivers. So it's a site of a lot of history, and there's a museum that's there, open in the summer months. And I got involved with a group called the Friends of Spokane House, and we would put on living history encampments every summer and do educational days for the local school kids. So wanting to learn more specifically about the fur trade that happened here early on, that's when I became aware of David Thompson. And this man who traveled through this region, and I wanted to know more about him and why he was important, why I kept hearing his name as opposed to, say, Lewis and Clark. In the United States, we hear a lot about the Corps of Discovery and Lewis and Clark because they're kind of our national heroes for this epic journey that they did. The Canadians talk more about David Thompson because he did an epic journey too, many journeys. And so they regard him more than Lewis and Clark, and us vice versa. But the interesting thing was that David Thompson came down through this region pretty soon after Lewis and Clark had come west and spent a lot of time in this area. He's a guy who traveled in his lifetime, they say, over 50,000 miles in North America on horseback, foot, canoe, dog sled. And during that time, really, nobody that was with him died. He was a survival skills expert, you could say, and a brilliant guy, too. So the thing I like about him, too, is his journals give us a window into that time period where we don't have a written history about the native cultures that were here that we can look back on. We can look through his journal and hear at least what his perspective as a European was of the cultures that he came into, and how he traded with them, and what his interactions were. So, so to give you a little bit of background about the fur trade in general, before I kind of launch into more of Thompson and his travels into here, in just the history of the world, trade between cultures has been going on since the beginning of time, you could say. Different people have been trading with one another, whether it's bringing things that occurred at the ocean, shells and fish and things from the sea inland, and trading that with the inland people. Cultures in every continent have been trading, and sometimes over vast distances, hundreds and thousands of miles. And the indigenous people of North America did the same thing. They were trading over huge expanses with one another since, before written history. And so when fur traders initially started to come into the eastern half of North America, it wasn't an unknown thing to native people, this idea of trading for what I have and what you have. And what a lot of these Europeans wanted were furs. Furs were very valuable back then. They were seen as being something that could that could be made into a lot of things. We typically kind of think of furs as being something that was made into a fur coat or a fur hat or mittens that are the actual just fur on the skin sewn into an item. But the thing that really drove the fur trade was beaver fur, and that fur was actually made into a felt material, kind of like this hat here. This is probably a more working class man's hat that's a mixture of wool and maybe rabbit hair. And but the gentlemen in big cities like London, Paris, New York, it was very fashionable in the later 1700s and through the 1800s to have these black top hats of different kinds. In the colonial era, the tricorn style hats, those were often made, the really high class ones were made from beaver fur. The tall stovepipe hats, that was beaver fur. And there was a process by which people had learned in Europe to remove the fur from the beaver skin and felt that material into a really durable kind of felt like this. And then it would often be dyed black. Some of them were sometimes brown or other colors. So a lot of those hats from that time period were beaver fur. And even today, if you go buy one of the fancy Stetson hats at a Western store, it's also beaver fur. It's still used today. So that's what really drove a lot of this whole fur trade industry, was fashion and what was fashionable in the time period. So by 1670, there was the Hudson's Bay Company. Has everybody heard the name Hudson's Bay Company before? They're famous for these blankets, kind of like you see here, especially the multi-color striped ones a lot of people have. The Hudson's Bay Company started in 1670, and it was a group of explorers who had this idea to start a fur trading company, and they went and petitioned the King of England to do this, and he gave them this charter to say that you have rights to all the furs from all the rivers that drain into Hudson's Bay. That's almost half of, probably more than half of Canada, massive expanse of land. Today, that's a ridiculous notion to us that you can just say, this is your land, you can take what you want from it. Because back then, there were thousands of tribal people that also lived all around that watershed that considered that their territory and, their furs and everything. But Hudson's Bay, their notion was, if we come in here and we set up some trading posts on this bay, we'll wait for, in the springtime, we'll wait for the native people to come to us, bring us all their year's catch of furs, and other trade goods too. Sometimes this wasn't just furs, sometimes it was things like plants that were harvested, fish that were caught, things that could help supply food for the people at the trading posts, the laboring class that worked there. Early on, the notion wasn't to send men out as trappers, like a lot of us are familiar with of the Rocky Mountain fur trade, where these young American men would go out, do the trapping, and bring the furs back. The idea was to build these fur trading posts and let the native people bring the furs to you. And then the incentive for them is you have these unique trade goods to trade for those furs. Things that were pretty unknown at that time period, like metal knives of different sorts. If you think about having, come from a culture that's only known stone and bone and antler as your cutting tools, a metal knife was pretty unique, kind of strange material. Like, this thing holds an edge really well. It's very durable. It's pretty lightweight for what it is. Metal axes also. A lot of the trade goods also kind of were to appeal to the native women. Things like sewing awls and needles, scissors, thimbles. A lot of that stuff, fabrics, like these red and blue woolen fabrics, a lot of that stuff was to appeal to them because they did a lot of that labor that involved making the clothing for the family, processing the food, so having a knife was pretty handy. And people didn't need this stuff because they had been surviving for thousands and thousands of years with stone, bone, antler, hides, the things that they could find in nature. But you can imagine with coming in with some of these things that are brightly colored and unique, blue and red fabrics like this, It's pretty unique stuff. It's very vibrant. It's hard to obtain those colors in nature. Woolen material was very warm even when it got wet. And those materials were also, things like glass in the form of beads. If you were used to shell and bone beads and stuff, well, these glass beads from Venice were pretty amazing. So even though people didn't necessarily need this stuff, it was novel and unique to them, and it was a sign of status in some cases. In some cases, it might have just been a utility thing of, geez, wouldn't it be great to cook in a brass or copper kettle like this? When I've been used to cooking to boil water, taking the paunch of a buffalo or a deer and suspending it over sticks and filling it with water and then putting hot stones in it to bring it to a boil. You can imagine the amount of time that took as compared to this thing that you could put right on the coals in the flame and heat it up pretty quickly, and it would last you ages if you took care of it. Even when the stuff wore out, these things were cut up and improvised into arrowheads and jewelry, like, this brass doodad I have on my earring here. All kinds of things were repurposed like that. Because these materials, bringing this in was, like I said, things that were hard to find in nature. A glass mirror like this. Some of these things didn't cost much at all to produce back in England and France, but you could bring them here and you could trade a knife for maybe an entire beaver skin. And that beaver skin had a greater value for that knife, so it was a good trade for the trader. They made out, and the native person looked at that and said, well, that's a pretty handy thing for me to have. That's a good deal. I'll take that. There were some situations too where some of the native people, they didn't easily, there's this notion that's kind of been perpetuated that these traders came in and forced this stuff upon the native people and stole the furs. In a lot of these situations, the Indian people had the upper hand because they were a massive tribe, and these traders were coming in as sometimes like 6, 7, a dozen traders, trader and a few, maybe an interpreter with him and some other trappers and hunters. So they were at the whim of what these, the native people were willing to trade for. They didn't just come in and say, hey, I got these things, give me your furs. And in some situations, like the Coeur d'Alene didn't easily trade for whatever that person wanted. They might have brought in, some of their beaver furs and river otter and mink to trade, and the trapper said, or the trader, I should say, said, hey, I'll give you this kettle. How about you give me 3 of your beaver skins for this? And they said, no, how about I give you 1 beaver skin and you give me that kettle? And that's the French, so those early French trappers started calling them the Coeur d'Alene, which in French means heart of the all. A pointed heart is what David Thompson called them in his journal. And that's a weird phrase to us today, but saying somebody had a pointed heart was saying they were shrewd, they weren't willing to give you what you wanted very easily. And so that's where that name came from. The penderet was another French name meaning it was like pendulum, a pendant. And oreille is ear in French. So the earring Indians, the ear pendants, because they were known for wearing these large shell earrings. A lot of French words for things. This whole region, if you were here back around 1809 when Thompson first came to Lake Pend you would have primarily, among all the different native languages, you would have heard French being spoken among the trappers and traders. That was the language of the fur trade, essentially. And Thompson knew how to speak and write in French. He also knew some of the Indian sign language. There was a universal sign talk with hands that were used by all the tribal people, and then the traders learned that language too, so they could communicate if they didn't know the spoken language. So by 1779, this Hudson's Bay Company's been happening for 100 years. They've been doing their thing, trapping out of obtaining furs from trappers coming into their fur posts on Hudson's Bay, taking all those furs back across the Atlantic to England to make into clothing and hats and such. During that time, there starts to be all of these independent traders who instead say, you know what, I'm going to actually go 100 miles out into the wilderness in the middle of winter, and before this tribe of Indians comes in to trade with the Hudson's Bay, I'm going to bring trade goods to them and obtain their furs, and now I'm going to go make a profit. The Hudson's Bay Company didn't like this because it's undercutting their sales, but it's the way business happens, right? Just like today we have this new notion, well, at least in my lifetime, of bringing all the goods to your doorstep that you order online, right? That wasn't a thing when a lot of you were growing up, I'm sure. But this sort of competition was happening back then. And the Northwest Company formed from some of these independent traders. It was this group that got together and said, hey, what if we band together, start our own fur company to compete against Hudson's Bay, and instead of us staying on the bay waiting for the Indian people to come to us, we're going to go out there, far out sometimes. A lot of these guys would go maybe even thousands of miles up rivers into far-flung places of Canada and overwinter with the tribe, sometimes marry into the tribe, and obtain that trade. And by doing that, you can imagine the Hudson's Bay Company, or the Northwest Company, started to have a lot more of a respect among the indigenous people, because they're saying, well, these people are willing to come and be part of our culture and live like us. And a lot of these men who did this as their job, they were what back then was referred to as a mixed blood. That was what the terminology was. These were guys who were part French and part native. A lot of times their father might have been a Frenchman who maybe paddled canoes for the Hudson's Bay Co., or he was a trapper. Maybe he built birch bark canoes for the fur company and married a native woman. And now their children, the children of the fur trade that were part of this, they were of this mixed culture where they could speak French. They might have also spoken Cree and Ojibwe and other languages. And the young men of those tribes who were of this mixed heritage learned to be part of that economy of the fur trade, but they were also well adept at all of these survival skills of the time. They had learned all these traditional skills. The women also, learning from the time they were young girls how to tan all the hides to make the clothing, build the lodges for your home, trap and snare and gather all the plant foods. So 1770, there's this guy, this young boy who was born in Wales named David Thompson. And his father dies when he's, I believe it was 7 years old. His father passes away, and the wife had, I think he had another sibling or two, and she wasn't able to take care of all these kids on her own. So this young man, David Thompson, she decided to bring him to London and put him in this orphanage called the Greycoat School. And there were some of these schools around England back then where if you were an orphan child, you would be put into one of these schools, and you would learn, you'd learn math and science and everything that you needed in that life. And he was a very adept student at math, and the teachers recognized this pretty early on. This kid was pretty brilliant. And something that was kind of unique about this Greycoat School is the Hudson's Bay Company would come there every year, and they would select some of the best and brightest of the students to be apprentices to come to Hudson's Bay and work as a clerk in the fur post. So there were two boys that year who got selected by the Hudson's Bay Co. to come and be clerks, and one of them ran away, and the other one was David Thompson. And that he would have been 14 years old. He got on a ship from England, sailed the whole way to Hudson's Bay. Can you imagine going from a big city like London at that time period and coming into Hudson's Bay, where in the wintertime it's maybe getting down in the negative 50s. It's the fur posts inside. They said even with the stove going, we're freezing cold inside. There's polar bears and huge caribou herds and all these different native cultures coming into trade, speaking these different languages. It would be like going to the moon. It would have been an incredibly big change from where this kid grew up in this orphanage in London. The funny thing is, he never went back. he spent the rest of his days in North America doing all of this traveling. So this young guy, David Thompson, ends up at one of these fur posts on Hudson's Bay. He has an apprenticeship for 7 years to be there and be part of the Hudson's Bay Company and work for them during that time period. And really, he has nowhere else to go. He can't decide to walk home, if he got tired of it. So it was kind of I imagine that after the novelty of that wore off, it was a pretty mundane kind of job. It would be sitting in this little fur post all through the winter, trying to occupy your time when you weren't keeping track of the books of how many furs were traded for whatever goods. There was a lot of idle time. And he happened to be, during this time, he was out in the winter. I believe he was doing something like bringing firewood home or doing some kind of daily chore. And he had a fall down an embankment and broke his femur. And he ended up bedridden for many, many months because of this leg break. And during that time, he was really depressed. But there happened to be this man who came through that was a really skilled practical astronomer, which would be somebody who at that time studied the alignment of the stars and the planets and this angle of those things in relation to the horizon of the Earth, and did all of this advanced mathematics to then be able to pinpoint where you are on planet Earth based on all of those kind of connections. And Thompson, being very mathematical, took to this and said, "Teach me, I want to learn about this." And this man taught him all of this knowledge about practical astronomy. And he began practicing this kind of skill. He ended up for another period of years with the Hudson's Bay Company and working with them. He traveled out into the plains and spent winter with the Blackfeet at one point to secure trade with them. He got to spend a winter with a tribal elder in his lodge as basically, getting to be mentored by this man who was in his 90s named Sakamape, who was a Blackfoot elder. This guy was a man who had seen the first coming of the horses to his people. He was that old that he was there when the horse first came to the Blackfeet. He was there when the guns first came from the trader. So he was somebody who saw culture change in a massive way. And Thompson was able to kind of hear stories from this guy around the campfire at night and learn about him and start to learn some of the Blackfoot language. Something I really respect about David Thompson is that he was somebody who, as a person who wanted to be able to travel vast distances and survive in the wilderness, he really wanted to learn from the native people and what their methods were to survive. He didn't see that stuff and say, well, I know better, I'm a mathematician, I grew up in one of the best schools. He instead was like, no, I need to learn how to do this. So he was somebody who knew how to make things like birch bark canoes, to make a pair of snowshoes with a crooked knife, the style of draw knife that the native people used, to net the snowshoes with rawhide, hunt and fish and do all of these things. He kind of wanted to learn all of that stuff. The thing that started to happen, though, is that the Hudson's Bay Company just wanted him to be a clerk. And he had these aspirations to become more than that, to be a map maker and a cartographer and really make these incredible maps that he knew he was capable of. And the Hudson's Bay Company, kept having him be at these different fur posts as a clerk, or having him do these different trading outings. And he got kind of tired of it and said, you know what, I'm going to leave. I'm going off to find somebody who will value the skills that I have. And he got fed up and left one winter and walked 80 miles south to the Northwest Company fur post, the competition of the Hudson's Bay Company. So you can imagine that they did not like him very much after that. He was a traitor to them. He totally abandoned, went down there, told these Northwest Company, these gentlemen at the Northwest Company, hey, I have all of these skills. I've traveled all these distances. I know how to make maps and do all of this, figuring out latitude and longitude of where your fur posts are at, or where these native villages are at, and map it out. He said, yeah, we'll sign you on. We'll pay you well for it too. And they made him a partner in the company, which was a pretty big deal. He wasn't just a clerk like he had been with the Hudson's Bay Company. So, take a sip of water here. One of his first assignments was to go and help map out the headwaters of the Missouri River, or the Mississippi River, up around the Great Lakes. And they wanted him to help map that better so they could establish a more definite boundary between Canada and the United States, because at that point the boundary line only went to Lake Superior there, and it was all disputed territory. Whose land was the rest of it? So he spent quite a bit of time there, about a year, traveling all through that watershed and taking all these coordinates, writing all this stuff down, and making a map of that area that then they were able to use to decide that the border should be between from Lake Superior to the Lake of the Woods. And then from there, later, that stuff was all figured out later on in time. So after that assignment, he spent time up at Rocky Mountain House in 1800. And he was noticing when he was at Rocky Mountain House, which was up on the North Saskatchewan River in Canada, that there were some of these Kootenai men, this tribe that we hear the name of Kootenai. They were up in Bonner's Ferry, what's today's Bonner's Ferry, going north on this side of the Rocky Mountains, way up into Canada. And some of these Kootenai men were crossing over the Rockies and coming to the Northwest Company men and saying, hey, we have furs, we have things to trade with you. Bring some of your people to us and bring some of your trade goods. We want to trade. Thompson wanted to do this, but he didn't know the best way to cross the Rockies there. And he started to try to find a way over. And there were several journeys where they tried to hire a guide. At one point they hired, I believe it was a Cree guide, who was they called him the Rook. And the Rook was going to guide them on this path through the Rockies. He said, oh yeah, follow me, I know the way there. And they got partway into the mountains, and he said, I don't know where I'm at. Sorry. And it was just like really hard going, really treacherous terrain. They're trying to, bring pack animals and all this gear. And they just said, let's go back and try again. He ends up sending a couple guys to go then winter with the Kootenai people. And this was pretty common for the Northwest Company to do. They would send a man or sometimes a couple men to go to whatever tribe they were wanting to establish trade with and overwinter with them and basically secure the trade and make friendship with them, live among their people, with the idea that then this tribe would come and bring their goods to the Northwest Company post the next year. So he sends a few men to do that. These guys are supposed to come back in the spring of 1801 and bring a native guide from the Kootenai who's going to help them across. The problem is when they get out onto the North Saskatchewan, there's a tribe there called the Stoney Assiniboines, and one of their men who didn't like the Kootenai, they were enemies, I guess, murdered this guide. So again, their chances were shot at doing this. So some time passes, that they kind of give up for a little while after this. And it isn't until about 1806 that Thompson starts to come up with some other plans of how he's going to do this. He hears about this pass called, today we call it Howell's Pass. It didn't have that name. It probably had a native name from the Kootenai people, which is today, if you were to go up the Banff National Park, along the Icefield Parkway and the what do they call it, the Saskatchewan crossing there, I believe. There's actually a trailhead, and you can go about 20 miles to Howell's Pass. And that pass is a low spot in the Rockies there where you can then come down on the west side into the headwaters of the Columbia River, down to Lake Windermere and Columbia Lake. And Thompson has this plan to do this, but he knows that he can't just set out and go there. He has to kind of plan it in stages. So he sends a few different men over the pass the year before in 1806. One of them is named Jocko Finley, and another guy named Nicholas Montour. There might have been another man with them too. And they go over this pass with, their plan is to clear all the brush, clear the windfall and trees, and make it so pack animals can get through this trail. Because these guys are bringing bales, kind of like you see here, these bales full of trade goods on either side of a horse's pack saddle through this route. And they have to have it wide enough that they can get through there. So these guys go through, they spend this year clearing this trail. They get down to the headwaters of the Columbia, and then they're supposed to build a couple canoes. So they have some canoes that they can load the trade goods into from there. And they do this. They come back over. Plans are then made in the spring of 1807. Really early on, they start caching goods up the North Saskatchewan, making these caches of goods so that they can kind of get to these checkpoints, load the goods on horses or canoes, continue further up the river, and then at the headwaters of the Saskatchewan River is where this Howes Pass goes over. So spring of 1807, the reason they're planning to do it so early, and it was May of 1807, they wanted to make their way upriver on the North Saskatchewan, mind you. This is a pretty substantial river. And they thought if we do this early enough in the spring, the snow melt won't be so great that the waters are super high and rapid, but freezing cold. It would be like going out today and wading up to your waist in the Pend d'Oreille. The men who were in the canoes with all the trade goods, these are big birch bark canoes, probably 25 feet long, filled with maybe 2 tons of gear in all these bales, and their role is to paddle these canoes up the river as far as they can, but when they reach rapids and places where they have to portage, they have to either get out, unload everything, carry it around on land, carry the boat, put it all back in, or they had to line haul the canoe, meaning they would get out, walk in the water, probably, up to their waist sometimes, pulling this canoe through the water upriver. And so they're doing this while David Thompson and his wife and children are with them on horseback, and several other clerks, like a guy named Finnan McDonald. They're all traveling with Thompson on horseback, kind of paralleling the river as these canoes are making their way up the river. And they would meet at different points and different stages along the way. And they finally get up near the end of the headwaters of the North Saskatchewan there. And in mid-June, they finally go up this pass. Thompson and one of his other guys go up and scout the pass to make sure it's clear. It looks like it's good enough to pass. The snow is melted enough. And they go back and tell everybody, all right, it's time to do this. Load all the horses up. We're going up over. And so in June of 1807, they go up over Howes Pass and start making their way down to the headwaters of the Columbia. The thing that happened, though, is they were up there, Thompson got really frustrated because this trail was not well cleared. He got really upset with this guy, Jocko Finley, who he had appointed to break the trail for them. He said there was just, trees everywhere and their horses can't get through. And he was saying that Jocko should lose, I think it was half a year's wages or something, and should get paid because he did such a poor job at this. So I had the unique opportunity 2 summers ago to go with my father-in-law here up to Howes Pass. He had been taking a class at the Spokane Community College about David Thompson with a historian named Don Popejoy. And some of the men in his class were getting together and said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we made a trip up there and maybe we backpack up and camp out and see what this Howes Pass looks like today? And they start looking at the maps and learning about it, and they realize this is pretty rugged country, and it's about 20 miles in. And they said, well, all right, well, what if we find a horse packing guy? Maybe we can get an outfitter who can take us up there on horses. So they finally find somebody who's willing to do this, this horse packer out of Banff. And he asked me to come along and be basically the historical consultant. My role was, these guys were all going to be wearing all their modern clothes and stuff on horseback, but I was going to dress the part, see what it was like to ride on my horse dressed in moccasins and leather leggings and, all of this gear, which I did. And so we meet this horse packer up there in the first week of September, I guess it was. And he says, first thing he said to us is, all right, and it was like a rainy day, kind of not as cold as today, but pretty wet and rainy. And he says, I just want you guys to know it might be 10 hours in the saddle today. And we're all like, and I'm looking at these guys, and they're like, most of them are in their 70s, and I'm thinking, man, are we ready for this? All right, well, they're all like, let's do it. And I was like, if you guys can do it, I can do it. Let's give it a try. So we go, and he has all these horses for us. We have 18 horses or something. Yeah, this whole pack string of horses. We each got a horse to ride on. There were a few pack animals to load all the gear on. And I asked the outfitter, I said, do you mind if I ride in moccasins? He's like, that's not as safe. They don't have a heel on them, but if you're willing to do it, go for it. So we start out on this trail, and I was just like, man, I'm living the dream. This is awesome. Like, I feel like I'm taken back in time on this horse. I'm seeing some of the same cliffs and all of this stuff Thompson would have seen. And this outfitter, he tells us, yeah, we've been coming up here for the past couple of weeks, going back in here with chainsaws, clearing brush. You wouldn't believe how many trees are down on this trail. And he said, at a certain point, we can't even use the trail because it became so entangled with windfall. He said, we're just going to go out on the floodplain and ride the floodplain the rest of the way up to where we're going to base camp. So we do this, and it was the trail reminded me of what Thompson must have experienced. You're coming along and there's branches going like this, hitting you, scraping you from everywhere. It felt like, man, this is probably what he was mad at Jocko Finley about, all this debris and brush everywhere. We ride up through the floodplains of the North Saskatchewan River in early September, and it's all these little rivulets across this big, massive floodplain of just gravel and sand. And we cross these things, and sometimes they were just, part way up the horse's leg. Some of these other ones we'd start getting into, and the water's coming up, and the horse is going down. Next thing I know, the water's up to here on me in the saddle, and the horse is starting to get swept down river a little bit. I think we counted 46 crossings of these, some deeper than others. And finally, it ended up not being 10 hours in the saddle, but we made it up to the base camp in 6 hours in the saddle. And it was pretty brutal. I'd never ridden a horse that kind of distance, and I got off, and I'm like, oh. I know what people mean about saddle sore now. So we go to this base camp, and the next day we're about 2 miles from Howes Pass, so we decided we'll just camp here for the night. Tomorrow morning, after we recuperate, we'll make our way up and see this pass. And in our minds, we're kind of thinking, like, we'll get up to this pass, and it's going to be like open up on this like rocky mountaintop, and you're looking down on the headwaters of the Columbia, and the sun's coming through the clouds. That when you read about Thompson passing Howes Pass, they kind of make it sound like this, like he came out and there was the Columbia. And you get up there, we get up to this thing, and it's a space maybe the size of this room, a little clearing in the woods with all this thick spruce around us, just, 50, 60 foot spruce trees. You can't see more than a few feet beyond the trees. There was not the like big open clearing. But the Parks Canada has all these different kind of signage up there saying, 1807, David Thompson crossed this pass. The Kootenai people told him about this as a pass to come across. And we didn't end up going down the rest of the way to the headwaters of the Columbia, but we got to experience what that would have been like, at least getting up to that pass. And pretty unique experience. One of the other things that stood out to me too was I hardly saw any wildlife sign up there or actual like visual wildlife at all. On these floodplains, there's a lot of these sandy spots. You would think you'd be seeing tracks of stuff. So I'm on this horse thinking like, oh, I'm going to see grizzly bear tracks and maybe I'll see a bear. Just seeing nothing, not even a deer. I think I saw coyote tracks one time on this 20-mile ride. Like, that's so strange, we're way out here in the wilderness. Well, Thompson talked about they had a really hard time finding game on this trip. When they were crossing there in 1807, they were really hungry and they were eating up their provisions. When they got down to the headwaters of the Columbia, they were so starving after about a week, they found a dead horse that they speculated had died a day ago. And it was a wild horse. And they said, doesn't smell too bad, let's eat it. And he said they spent the rest of the night vomiting this up. And that wasn't the only time that happened. There were other times where they ate foul meat they found because they just couldn't find food. Another unique thing that happened on that trip was when they were really hungry too, they'd sometimes eat their dogs. And one of these, at one point they took one of these dogs that would also be carrying some of the gear, singed it over the fire like a pig and ate this thing. And one of these Frenchmen that was with him, he was known for being a really voracious eater, and he was just scarfing this dog meat down. A few days later, he has this sharp pain in his side, and he's telling Thompson, I can't work, I got these sharp pains in my side. And David Thompson has him lay down and look at him, and he pushes on his skin, and out of this welt on his skin, a porcupine quill comes point first from the inside.
Oh.
And he says, what is this all about? And they thought about it, and they said, a dog we ate, that's that same one that was quilled by a porcupine several months ago. It probably had quills in its meat, and this guy scarfed the meat down, and the quill worked its way out through his insides out. He was fine after that, though. These are the kind of like gems of history that you'll read about in Thompson's journal that are just like really fascinating, because you'll page through many pages of his journal where it's just like a fine day, cloudy weather, took coordinates for our trip today, and then you'll hit these other little gems where it's like, wow, that's really interesting. What life was like for them and how hard it was sometimes, how much they suffered but weren't turning back. They kept going and kept going. It just amazes me. Like, I feel like today, most people in my generation would say, heck with this, I'm going back to my cushy house, You didn't have the choice to a lot of times back then, though. And I like those kind of inspiring stories from Thompson's journal. So they make it over 1807 down into the headwaters of the Columbia. They start building a trading post right away because they want to protect all these trade goods they have, because they also know that on the other side of the Rockies to the east, there's a few tribes over there that are very big and powerful. One of them is called the Blackfeet, another one called the Piegan. There was the Gros Ventre, which meant big bellies in French. And these were a group of tribes that were all kind of allied with one another. They had big numbers. They were tribes that had horses and firearms before any of the Kootenai or Kalispell or Spokane people did. So they kind of dominated all of that part of the eastern side of the Rockies and clear down into what's today like Thompson Falls area, Montana. They would come into, and sometimes even over across the Rockies into this, that is across the Rockies in Thompson Falls there. So the problem is that the Kootenai would sometimes go across the Rockies to go hunt buffalo. Sometimes the Kalispell people and the Flathead people would go try to hunt buffalo in that part of Montana. And they were considered enemies to the Piegan and the Blackfeet. And if you were found in their territory hunting what they considered their buffalo, they'd kill you and take everything you owned. And it happened on many, many instances. So because they had superior firepower, superior numbers, and what started to happen was a lot of these Kootenai people, Kalispell people, Spokane, they not only wanted some of these other trade goods that were just things that were unique and colorful or made life easier, but they wanted, a lot of the men wanted the firearms. The flintlock firearms were what they saw as being the thing that would be valuable to them. So Thompson was going to be bringing some of these with him to trade. Not huge amounts of these. There was probably a couple cases of them that he'd be bringing along to trade. And this would be what was called a Northwest trade gun. The style of gun is a smooth bore flintlock. They would have this brass serpent on the side plate here of the lock. They were some of the other distinct things about them. They had this really big trigger guard on them. They had a very large lock compared to like a Kentucky rifle or some of the other guns of the time period. And they came in like 3 standard sizes, a 42-inch barrel, a 36, and a 32. And they were a pretty cool thing to the native men. They wanted one of these, even though they had been hunting for eons with bows, spears, and were very competent at those. You could shoot off many more arrows before you could load and fire one of those things. If you had this plus a bow, though, you were a pretty big adversary in battle, because you could fire that gun off, then you could pull your bow out still and fire your bow off. And they made a big boom, they were kind of intimidating. So the Blackfeet had these, and the Piegan had these firearms early on. They were kind of the middlemen in this fur trade because they were obtaining a lot of these trade goods from the traders to the east and cutting off the tribes to the west who also wanted to acquire some of that stuff. So the Piegan and Blackfeet started to see Thompson as an adversary because he's going to be arming now their enemies by him coming across the Rockies and bringing firearms and also things like metal arrowheads. If you shot one of these warriors who had a buffalo rawhide shield with a standard like obsidian or stone point, they're often such a tough rawhide shield that it would shatter on the shield. But a musket ball would penetrate right through it. An iron arrowhead could penetrate right through that shield. So some of these things like really gave the upper hand in battle. And you could see why the Piegan would be upset about Thompson coming over here and supplying the Kootenai with those things. So they start building this trading post on the east side of those lakes up there, Lake Wandermere in Canada. And the Kootenai men come to them. They have this first little post, this log structure already made. Thompson's putting a door on it. They're going to put all their trade goods in there. And the men say, this isn't a great place to have this thing built. This is what we consider the war road of the Piegan. They come right up and down through here. You're putting yourself at danger having your stuff right in this spot. You'd be better off going across the lake to the other side. And so they consider their options, and they're like, oh, yeah, I guess we should scrap this plan. And they go across the lake to the other side and find this hillside that kind of overlooked the lake and kind of looks out on that whole valley, and that's where they built what they called Kootenai House. Probably would have been like 3 log structures. One was to store the trade goods and furs in, and one for Thompson and any of the other kind of the gentlemen of the fur trade, the guys who were more of the upper class members of the trade. And then the trappers would often be, the hunters and guys who were the canoe paddlers would just sleep outdoors. So they build this fort, they do some trade with the Kootenai. Thompson wants to start finding his way down into this region because he knows there's also tribes down here that would be likely willing to trade furs. And he wants to map more of this area. He knows about this river called the Columbia, and he wants to find this water route, this famed Columbia, and see if it can get to the Pacific, from where he's at. But he doesn't know that he's on the headwaters of the Columbia right here at this point, because the Columbia flows north, then bends 180 and goes south before it comes down into the U.S. And he gets a guide to take him down across a portage from these lakes to Kootenai River. There's this unique spot there where just a couple miles between this Columbia Lake and south of that is the Kootenai River flowing past. There's just a couple mile portage that'll take you right to the river from these lakes. And they do that, and they get on this river, and they paddle some of that distance. But it's late in the fall, and you realize, I better get back before things really freeze up. And he ends up coming back. But this guy who took him on and was a guide for him, was a Kootenai man he had the unfortunate name of being called Ugly Head, was the translation of his name. A lot of times this name would have been said in whatever the native language was, translated to French, and then Thompson would translate the French to English in his journal. And this guy, they called him Ugly Head because his hair was really curly. And that was unique among their people to have this really curly hair. I don't know if that was really what his people might have called him something a little different. And through the translation, it came out as Ugly Head. There were other guys that had these weird names like Big Kidney or the Old Dog, and when you read through some of the characters, the names they gave to him were really kind of comical. They spend this first year. The other unique thing is Thompson has his wife and 3 children with him on this whole trip. They're on horseback doing this trip over House Pass. The kids are coming along for the ride. I think they're somewhere between ages like 1 through, I think it's something like 7 or 8 years old. And they have to then go back over in the springtime, back over the Rockies, down this pass, and head back and bring all the furs back, resupply with new trade goods, and bring them back again. This is a very, very long journey. And that next spring, they head back over, and Thompson's wife and children go with them, and they don't cross the Rockies again. They stay back on the east side for the rest of that time, while Thompson keeps doing a few more years of this back and forth trip over the Rockies. By 1809, he makes his way further down into this region, making his way down to Bonner's Ferry with native guides like this guy Ugly Head, who's helping him out, show him the way, and then basically follows what's today Highway 95 down from Bonner's Ferry to Sandpoint out onto the Pack River Delta at Lake Ponderay. And when they get there, they meet up with some Flathead and Kalispell people who bring canoes for them, and they're able to take all the goods off of horses and put them into these canoes, and they begin paddling eastward toward the Clark Fork River Delta on the lake, trying to find a place to make a trading house to trade among the Kalispell. And they come to a place out on the Clark Fork River Delta that was called Indian Meadows. Today it's underwater because of the Albany Dam. The rise of the water has made that low area underwater, but it used to be a spot where a lot of the tribal people would meet and fish and trade. It was a rendezvous point for them. So he saw this, there's already native people here. These are the people that I'm wanting to trade with. Let's build the fur post somewhere really close to here. So they make this trading post called Kalispell House. And I shouldn't say Thompson builds this. Usually in these situations, he's telling his laborers, you build this, I'm going to be over here taking my coordinates, figuring out what latitude and longitude we're at, keeping the books, all this kind of, book work and things of that nature. But he also is he's skilled in helping out with a lot of these crafts also. So they build Kalispell House and begin trading with the Kalispell people. Pretty soon after that, he sends some of his guys further up the Clark Fork River to what is Thompson Falls, Montana today, and builds Salish House. And because the people we call the Flathead today, they were called the Salish. They were part of the Salish language group. That's kind of all the people in this region speak a form of Salish. It's all like a related language group. And these people got the name the Flathead. They think the reason was because of the native sign. I was talking about the sign talk that was used. There were all these signs for who your tribe was. And they say that the Flathead sign was something like both hands or a single hand put on the forehead like this, because of the men's hairstyle was to kind of make this little coif in the front that would sort of flare up like that. And this got interpreted as being the tête plate by the French, the flathead, and that's how that name stuck. And like I mentioned, the Pont de Ré, the Coeur d'Alene, these are all French names given by these early French traders. So they make Salish House over there, build that fort. Pretty soon after that, Finan MacDonald, one of Thompson's clerks, and he's a clerk, but he's also a trapper and hunter with the group. He goes out with a party of flathead men and some Pont de Rés, and they go to hunt buffalo over in Montana. And they're hunting over there, and they have a battle with the Piegan, and they end up getting into a pretty bloody battle. And because they have some of these firearms now, and Finan MacDonald's with them, he probably has a rifle as opposed to a smoothbore, which is much more accurate. They end up killing quite a few more of the Piegan than they could kill of them, you know. So it was a little bit, the tide had turned in the battle on that one, and they came back from this battle to Salish House and said, we probably shouldn't stick around here very long. There's going to be a retaliation against us staying here. And they leave, and they head the whole way back over to Spokane House. So by 1810, in spring of 1810, there was a fort built called Spokane House at the junction of the Spokane and Little Spokane rivers. Spokane House was built by this guy, Jocko Finley, who was Thompson's guy, who was supposed to blaze the trail over House Pass. He and Thompson ended up making friendly with each other after that whole dispute of him not clearing the trail well enough. But he sends Jocko there to build this Spokane House trading fort, and that would have been right at the junction of those rivers where there was a large fishing village. So those were the three big trading posts in our area here. And some of the characters that you might hear the names of, like Finan MacDonald, Jocko Finley, you see names around, roads and things, rivers and things called Jocko or Finley, Thompson, MacDonald. These are all names that are fur trade era names that were here from very early on. And on the tribal reservations around here, a lot of those names still persist because these men were married into the tribes. They became part of the tribes, and their names still carry on throughout the native population. Jocko Finley, for example, has a huge following of relatives, people that are very distant relatives of his that like to claim Jocko Finley as an ancestor of theirs because he was known for being a pretty skillful guy at survival skills and hunting and trapping. He lived out his days at Spokane House. This Spokane House functioned up until 1826. And when they realized the Spokane River wasn't navigable enough to be bringing trade goods in and out to the Columbia, so they gave it up, moved everything north to Fort Colville up at Kettle Falls. And that was a much better location to be right on the river, bring the furs in from the Pacific up to Kettle Falls there to Fort Colville. But Jocko Finley lived out the rest of his days till 1828 at Spokane House. And there was rumor that he was buried under the east bastion of the fort, one of these watchtowers on the east side of the fort. And indeed, when they did the archaeological digs there in the 50s and 60s, they found his remains under the east bastion, along with some clay pipes like this that he had. One of them had a JF carved into it. He had a pair of spectacles. He had a knife, kind of one of these knives like this. And so Jocko's buried there today with all those things of his. Let's see. I don't want to take up too much time with the history side of things, but also want to show and tell some stuff here too. So I kind of have the tables divided up roughly into like some of the native crafts and goods, and then the European trade goods, with the exception of my firearm being over here because it wouldn't fit on this table. So I'll just show some of this stuff as examples of some of the things that the native people would have worn, made, used, and were valued by the traders as things to trade for those kinds of goods. Tanned skins, buffalo provided everything you needed. So this hide that you see everything sitting on here on the table, this is a buffalo robe, meaning basically a big buffalo blanket. And you would sleep under that. You'd wear it around you to keep you warm like a coat. It's brain tanned, meaning it's tanned using the brains of the buffalo to soften the leather, and then it's smoked. They would also use the summer hides of the buffalo when there wasn't fur on it to tan and make a buckskin, more buckskin type of leather like this, without the hair for teepee lodges, clothing. This is actually a deer skin here that's brain tanned. This is one I did a few weeks ago. It still hasn't been smoked. Once this gets smoked, it'll take on a more kind of tannish brown color like that. So all of these things were what people wore, kept their goods in. These are called parfleches. They were rawhide envelopes that carried your goods. They were like panniers that would carry on your horse for keeping your clothing and food in. They were made from a matching pair were usually made to carry those things in. It was made of the buffalo hide. So some of the really early ones were the epidermis layer under the hair was carved into to make designs. Some of them were done with the flesh side facing out and then painted on with mineral pigments to make more of these painted designs on them. But they were like your suitcases to travel with. The furs in the time period, beaver wasn't the only thing that was being traded. Muskrat skins were valued, and these would have been like dimes to the dollar. So 10 of these were equal to 1 beaver pelt. So when we talk about the beaver skin, the thing that's important to know about the fur trade era was that it was the currency of the time period. It was like it was the coin everything was based on, basically. So as a native person, I could have brought in a pair of moccasins, for example. If and these were made by the native women primarily. They did all of the sewing craft. They made those parfleches. All of that stuff was in the work of. It was the women's kind of art form and things they excelled at. But they had things they could trade. They didn't necessarily have to go trap a beaver. A woman could bring in moccasins or a deer skin she tanned and trade some of these things for some of these trade goods. And they would have a certain valuation in beaver. Like one deer skin, I'd have to look at some of the different ledgers, but one deer skin might be equal to 1 beaver pelt. So the clerk at the fort would be able to look through this ledger book, and if he wasn't sure of the valuation of something, somebody brought in a deer skin and maybe some muskrat, he could look through there and say that, okay, well, it looks like your deer skin is worth 1 beaver, 10 of your muskrat are equal to 1 beaver, so you get 2 beaver in credit you can spend now at the fur post. So at times there was ways of recording that. Sometimes a person would just purchase that right there, whatever they needed. But there was also ways of having something you could take home if you didn't buy something right then, that you could hold on to it and come back and say, this is how much credit I have. Some posts had these kind of little square sticks with markings on them. Eventually, the Northwest Company had these beaver tokens. This is a replica of one here, and it would says token 1820 Northwest Company on the back of it, and it has the Northwest Company emblem of a beaver there. So one of these would be 1 beaver credit, and you could use that at the post to buy something. But there wasn't really money floating around out here so much. Like there weren't dollar bills, there weren't all these coins that when you brought your goods in, you got, actual physical money for. You got a certain value in beaver that you could spend at the fur post, and that's the way it worked. So Thompson, he continued making this trip across the Rockies. And in 1810 it was, the winter of 1810, they were going to cross over Howell's Pass, but they heard that there was these Piegan warriors who were enemies of the Kootenai, were blockading the pass. And he had heard about this and knew that they weren't going to be able to make it over there because these guys were saying, we're going to kill you if you try to make it over there again and harm our enemies. So he decided that he had heard about this other pass way out of the way to the north called the Athabasca Pass. The middle of winter, they go up and they cross like 50 miles out of the way north because they know that's out of the territory of the Piegan. These warriors don't generally make their way up into that area. They cross over in the middle of winter, and with dog teams pulling toboggans with all the gear on it. As they're crossing the mountain, Thompson, he talks about this in his narrative that he wrote when he was living back in Montreal in his elder years, and was recalling a lot of his stories. He says that he saw the tracks of an animal that were massive that he couldn't explain in the snow as they were crossing this pass. And the native guide that was with him also said, I don't want to follow these tracks to find out what they are because they belong to a monster that's known to live in these mountains. And Thompson, you would think that being somebody who was very scientific and well, learned and, literate and everything, that he would have said, oh, yeah, it's just a grizzly bear, But he said in his memoirs that looking back, he still could not figure out what those tracks were from. So that's kind of, a lot of people like to cite that as one of the earliest accounts of a Sasquatch being in the Rocky Mountains. So another one of those little gems that comes out of Thompson's journals that's kind of fascinating. But that's how they then after 1810 started crossing over, was at this Athabasca Pass. And they continue to do this whole routine of, they would take these furs every spring, and some of the men, usually Thompson along with them, would cross the Rockies, go back down to North Saskatchewan and follow that highway of rivers the whole way down to Rainy Lake House, which is another one of these fur posts that was pretty close to Lake Superior. A several thousand-mile journey. I think it's probably over 2,000 miles this trip would take. So it would be all summer long, basically, going down there, getting everything back before fall. All the furs would be swapped out. New trade goods would be brought in these bales, loaded up, paddled back up before freeze up in the fall, and do the whole thing over again, bring all the trade goods back into the area. You can tell, though, that's not in a very, very efficient way. So they were really hoping maybe there's this better way of bringing things to the mouth of the Columbia by ship, and then bringing things up the Columbia into this region. And by about 1813, 1814, that's what started to happen, is that the trade goods would go down around South America. They would usually stop over in the Hawaiian Islands to resupply, make it up then to the mouth of the Columbia, and all the trade goods would go from there from what was called Fort George once the Northwest Company took hold of it. This was originally Fort Astoria. So this is the thing about this whole story, is the details can just overwhelm you with how much there was going on, because in 1811 there was this other party, an American enterprise by John Jacob Astor. He wanted to make a fur post at the mouth of the Columbia and start this whole fur business out west here. So he sent a party overland to basically follow Lewis and Clark's route and go to the Columbia, and he sent a party around South America by ship on the Tonquin was this ship. And the ship, of course, got there first in 1811, and they started building this Fort Astoria. And Thompson had heard that there was this happening, and he wanted to go down there and see it. And he also wanted to, try to show that, like, Great Britain's already here, we're trying to establish trade here. Well, they built some canoes that they could float down the Columbia and get down there and check it out. And the way they did that, Thompson had been familiar with this method of building these trade canoes out of birch bark. And this birch bark was best on the eastern side of the Rockies. The bark was really nice and thick. They could make canoes. Some of these fur trade canoes were 35 feet long. They would nearly fill this room here, and 6 feet across in the middle. So you'd have 15 to 18 men in these things, several tons of cargo, and these are what they would paddle on the the big lakes like Lake Superior, and more inland going up into the North Saskatchewan, like I was talking about. They used a smaller version called a North Canoe that was usually 24, 25 feet long. But this birch bark made this possible. These cedar framework with this birch bark, the seams being all sealed with a type of pitch glue made from spruce pitch. All of it was lashed together with the roots of spruce trees. Thompson wanted to make those when he came over here, but he found that the birch here doesn't have as thick of a skin to it. It's not an adequate bark for making those canoes from. And he just, struggled for the first few months trying to figure out what kind of boat they were going to build. The native people from around this region, the boat that they built was these sturgeon nose canoes. If you've ever seen those, where the bow and stern sort of sweep down to the water line rather than curving up. Those were made from the bark of the western white pine. And they would often get a lot of that bark from trees up at Priest Lake. That was known to be the good spot to get the white pine for these sturgeon nose canoes. So, but those canoes couldn't be made to this kind of cargo size. They were more like the size of your modern day kind of 18-foot canoe. So Thompson experimented for a while and came up with this idea to use a mixture of kind of native and indigenous technology, or European and indigenous technology, using this lashing technique of spruce roots and sealing with pitch glue, but instead of using a bark skin, he splits out all of these boards from cedar trees. And there was a spot, they made some of these up at Kettle Falls and on the Columbia. They also, kind of where they would cross Athabasca Pass and come down to the Columbia, there was a spot they called Boat Encampment where they were also building some of these. And they would make these big canoes by splitting out these 7 or 8 foot plank, 7 or 8 inch planks by, probably 25 foot long cedar, and then doing more of a European, like clinker built kind of boat where the planks layer against one another like this and they overlap. And but lashing this stuff together because they didn't have nails and everything to do this with. And he builds a replica, a prototype of one of these to try out, and it's a really lightweight boat. It's functional, it works, and they start building more of them, and that's what they went down, the whole way down to Columbia and back on. And they went down, visited with the historians who were there, had like pretty cordial conversation with one another, and visited, and there was still, it was kind of unknown to both parties at the time whose territory it was it American, was it British? But some of these historians also wanted to come up into this region, and so they also built a competing fur post at Spokane House there. So there was a short window of time where both the Northwest Company had a trading post and the historians, or what was called the Pacific Fur Company, had competing posts just within like rifle shot of one another. But with the War of 1812, the Brits said, hey, you got to give up that post or we're going to take it over. And the Americans sold out Fort Astoria to the British, and the Northwest Company moved in and took over what they called Fort Spokane. And they moved in there, and the Northwest Company started calling it Spokane House. So there's this little confusing bit of history where there were actually 2 competing fur posts side by side right there. Some of the other trade goods that were common, clothing was made by tailors at the forts. Some of it was also stuff that was manufactured in England and brought over. There were some curious other styles of hats and caps besides just like brim hats were really common for like the laboring class, the canoemen, the blacksmith, the trappers. These were called jockey caps, worn by a horse jockey back in England. But Thompson had on a couple of his lists of trade goods, he had like half a dozen jockey caps. And sometimes they were listed over at Fort William in Canada as being boys or kids' jockey caps. So they think that maybe they brought some of these for children to wear. Kind of a weird little bit of history. At a certain point, these Scots bonnets started to become a popular kind of hat. Father Nicholas Point, who was a missionary down, who spent time all around the inland northwest here. He was a Jesuit missionary. He had been down at, I'm forgetting the mission name down here below Coeur d'Alene. Cataldo, thank you. Blanking on names. He was kind of an untrained artist, and he did all of these sketches and paintings, and he had all these drawings of Flathead and Coeur d'Alene and Kalispell braves. And there were a lot of these drawings where he shows the men wearing these hats in the 1850s or so. So they think a lot of these were coming over from England and being traded at Fort Vancouver and over at Fort Hall, more southern Idaho. These Canadian toques, these sort of woolen knit hats, were very common way back. These were being worn in the 1600s in North America and way up in Canada. Usually made them in red and blue and gray were the common colors. The voyageurs, the guys who were the French canoemen, were the ones who were often known for wearing these. Sashes were really popular. Native women made sashes early on using finger weaving. There's this method of not even using it's not an intricate loom, it's basically a stick, and doing this kind of finger weaving. And early on they would have been weaving things like plant fibers, dog hair, mountain goat wool. But when wool from England was being introduced and different dyes, these red sashes became pretty popular. There were also some that were multicolored that were really popular coming out of like the Montreal area. Red and blue were super common colors, and I think probably because they're bright and unique colors compared to just like a brown or a green, but they're also symbolic colors because they're the color of blood. If you're a person who's kind of grown up only in the wilderness and been familiar with wearing things that are brown and these more muted colors, and you see something that bright, it's like, man, that's the color of the blood in my veins, it's the color of blood when it comes out of an animal or a person. It's kind of, they're very symbolic, bright colors. Same with the beads, beads offered those kind of unique, bright colors. Some of the other things that were really common trade items were wool blankets like this, especially these all-white ones with a big blue bar on either end. And there's kind of a misnomer that you can see on here. There's these little marks. They call these points. They're sometimes referred to as a point blanket or a trade blanket. This is a 4-point. And those just designated the size of the blanket. These would have been made in woolen mills back in England. And there's this notion, though, that shows how many beaver the blanket was worth. That's sort of been popularized by different authors in the early 1900s, and that wasn't true. It was just the size designation for the blanket. So back then, the common sizes were like there were 1 points, 2 points, 2.5s, 3s, 3.5 points. Today, there's these like 6 and 8 points, these mega big ones you can buy, but they didn't have those really large ones back then. So yeah, blankets like this would have often been just used as your blanket to sleep under, but they were also repurposed to make coats for wintertime. The French called this a capote, and a capote was a woolen coat. So these would have been sometimes made by a native woman just cutting up a blanket and sewing it into a coat. Sometimes there were these Spokane House had a tailor. Fort William back in Ontario had a tailor. A lot of these larger forts had a tailor. They had a blacksmith. They had carpenters. They had people there that could make some of the goods. The blacksmith could be hammering out trade axes or ice chisels or fixing traps. If a trapper brought in his traps and they got, a spring broke and it needed repaired, the blacksmith could repair it. So I guess that kind of brings up another point I should mention is that, like I said early on in this trade, the idea was to build a post, have the Indians come to you with their furs, and you would provide trade goods for them. But what started to happen is there started to be more of these free agents, these guys who wanted to go out and just be trappers themselves. And a lot of these guys in this area were men who had come over here as a engagé, which meant in French an engaged man, somebody who was under contract with the Northwest Company or the Hudson's Bay Company for a period of usually 3 years. And their job might have been to paddle the canoe for David Thompson, haul the goods, do all that heavy lifting. But once they got here and spent some time, their engagement was up with the company. A lot of them married into the tribes, decided to just stay here and live with their wives' people, wherever that might have been. And their occupation then was to just go out and hunt and trap. And then they would bring in their own furs to trade at the trading post. And so they were called a Jean libre, which meant a free man in French, or sometimes we call them in English a free trapper or a free hunter, because they had given up that engagement with the company and they were on their own hook to trap and try to earn their own living. The curious thing about a lot of these guys who worked for Thompson and with the Northwest Company, also with the Pacific Fur Company, there's guys who were called the Astorians. They were from this whole mix of cultures. There was a lot of Iroquois men. Iroquois from way back in New York State. A lot of those guys grew up in the fur trade in the 1600s. Their grandfather was probably a canoe man or a trapper, and their dad was, and they became the same. And so they came out west here with the Northwest Company, slowly probably made their way across northern Canada. And they were French-speaking, but they also had this mixture of their own kind of Iroquois culture. And a lot of them were Catholic or, had been introduced to the Christian religion. And so they were the first people that brought Christianity here, and kind of before the missionaries ever came here, they were the ones who introduced that notion of this new religion to the Salish people in this region. And because a lot of them, they were seen as being native people like them, they were kind of these, they weren't part of the upper class in the fur trade. Usually the guys who were the company men who had the higher paying jobs and were the lead men in the fur trade were guys who were Scottish and English, sometimes guys who were French, but a lot of the guys who were full-blood native or part French and part native, they often were considered to be lower class in this caste system that existed, and they couldn't really rise above the level of clerk in the fur trade. Like Jocko Finley, for example, he was kind of a unique example of somebody who was part Scottish but also part Cree Indian. And he ended up becoming a clerk and got a bit of a higher position. So did another man named Nicholas Montour. But usually they couldn't get beyond that and become what was called a partner in the company, a guy who had a share in the Northwest Company, or somebody who was a chief factor at a fort. So they saw themselves as being more part of the indigenous population and married into those groups. And there were also curious instances of the Astorians when they were coming around to supply, to build this Fort Astoria, and they stopped in Hawaii, or what they called the Sandwich Islands back then. They picked up some laborers there, some of these Hawaiian men, who came to work for the Pacific Fur Company. And so you had Hawaiians, they called them Kanakas back then. And outside of Fort Vancouver, when Fort Vancouver was built in the early 1820s, there was what was called Kanaka Village. It was like where the Hawaiians lived outside of the fort grounds. That's why you have some of these names in Oregon, like the Oahe River and stuff. It's Hawaiian is what they're basically saying. There's a kind of funny story where when Thompson made that canoe trip down to the mouth of the Columbia and was interacting with the Pacific Fur Company men, he had one of these guys, these Frenchmen with him, and he didn't like the guy. He just thought the guy was lazy and didn't work very hard and complained a lot. But he met this Hawaiian man that they called Cox, C-O-X. They called him that because they couldn't pronounce his Hawaiian name, and they knew some other Englishman named Cox that he kind of looked like. So they just said, well, we'll call him Cox. Anyway, Thompson really liked this Hawaiian guy, and he said, this guy's strong, he works hard. he traded his French-Canadian laborer for the Hawaiian guy and said, hey, you guys want to trade? I'll take the Hawaiian guy with me and you guys take this guy. I don't know if he told them the truth, that he thought his own guy was kind of a lazy guy, but he ended up bringing this Hawaiian man with him and like really respected him and thought he was a hard worker. And so there's this real mixture of cultures happening back then. But it was the other thing that should be mentioned is that the women in the fur trade played a massive role. We hear all those stories in the books about the trappers and the trailblazers and all the stuff that the men did, but their wives were often traveling with them, especially in this part of the fur trade. There was we hear less of this in the Rocky Mountains with the American trappers, but in this region, a lot of these men were coming in with their wives and children in tow, helping out. But they don't really write much like Thompson doesn't write much about it. Occasionally he'll say something like, the women were out gathering spruce root today, or today I had the women netting snowshoes for us. So they were doing all these really important tasks that needed to happen so that this whole, expedition or this industry could keep going on. But they're often not noted for that. And they did a vast amount of the work. In the native society, the women played the role of, taking care of their children, cooking all the food, sewing all the clothing, building the teepee, going out and foraging, hunting. They would snare small game and fish and do all of this stuff. And the men's role was often to hunt and, try to steal horses from other tribes or, fight off an enemy attack. So women had a massive role to play in all of this. And they were also, because out in this time period in the early 1800s, there were no white women from European kind of society out here. It was all native women that either came here from the Great Lakes region with their husband, or they were women from the tribes out here. So they had an opportunity to kind of raise up in society to some degree, because they were able to be like ambassadors for their culture, where they could help negotiate a trade between because they maybe had a husband who was part of that group of traders, or they acted as interpreters because they might have known a few different languages. If they had a husband who was French speaking and they started to speak French, they could interpret. And so it gave them some different kinds of roles to play. So before I keep going on too much, maybe we should open it up to some questions here, and that'll spark some other things that I want to talk about.
Yeah, Shaun, could you just comment on Thompson's attitude toward alcohol, the institution of marriage, and also kind of how he almost got lost to history in his later years?
Yeah.
Something I think is really an interesting part of his life.
Yeah, and that's a very good point to bring up. So the reason I bring a lot of this stuff to help jog my memory too as I'm talking, to be like, oh yeah, talk about that. This is supposed to represent the alcohol that was brought. Alcohol was another thing that was often traded to the native people. A lot of times it was rum or whiskey, and it had a very detrimental effect because they were not people that were familiar with alcohol. They didn't, for thousands upon thousands of years, never made alcohol. In a lot of situations, it really harmed their society when alcohol was brought in. It was in the Great Lakes region and east of there, going back to the East Coast. There's a lot of instances of traders intentionally using alcohol to take advantage of some of the tribes and knowingly using it to get them drunk, get more furs and goods, and take advantage of them. Thompson had a unique perspective. At least, there's some authors who have said, well, he engaged in these same practices in his early days of the trade too. He was trading alcohol also. But he talked about at one point being made to bring alcohol, I guess that was over across Howell's Pass, I think, and the fur company was saying, yeah, you have this many barrels of rum, you have to bring it with you. And he said that he intentionally put it on his most unruly horse because he knew that horse would dash it to pieces against the trees and rocks, and he'd be like, oh, sorry, the alcohol poured out, I don't have any. So I have heard some authors be like, well, I don't know how true that was. He claimed that in his memoirs that he wrote, that he did that. There was a unique instance too, though, where when there was that time period where Spokane House and Fort Spokane were side by side with one another, they made a pact. The company chief clerks there made a pact to not trade alcohol, both of them, with the Spokane people. So that was pretty unique for the fur trade. It didn't often happen in a lot of situations, but yeah, Thompson, he had, at least he talks about being ethical like that. As far as marriage, Thompson married a woman who was part Native and part, I believe she was part Scot. Her name was Charlotte Small, and her father was Patrick Small, who was a fur trader up at Isle La Crosse, like the Isle of the Cross in Canada. And when they married, she was 14 years old. That was really common back then. A lot of times they would marry a very young woman. But she was of this mixed heritage. I believe she was part Cree then, part Cree and Scot. And Charlotte Small was somebody that he stayed with for the rest of his life. She moved back to Montreal with him when he got out of the fur trade. And they lived out their days together until he died, I believe, 1857 or so. And that wasn't very common back then. There were a lot of these instances where these head men at these forts, they would come and they would marry a Native woman, have children with her, and then their time would be up there in the West, and they would leave her and the children and go back to Montreal and find a European wife. That happened a lot. Thompson was pretty unique in that, he even wrote about this in his journal, that like, how could he leave his wife? Like, he's had all these children with her, he's spent all this time, been through all these hardships together, and they lived out their days. I think the reason that happened a lot is back then it was seen as being pretty, you were looked down upon in that white society when you went back to Montreal if you had an Indian woman with you. And so a lot of these guys were kind of afraid to do that. So, it was pretty honorable of Thompson to bring his wife and his children with him. Any other questions?
I think I read that after that long, productive life, he was penniless and sold off.
Yeah. He when he left the mountains, I believe around 1813 is when he was last over here and made his way back and never returned back across the Rockies. He had done all the map making he could, had collected all this data in these books, this complex coordinates and stuff, and his goal was to go back, put all this together over time into this big set of maps of North America. So during that time, though, he was pretty successful at first with getting a farm for himself and starting to purchase some pieces of land, and he would go off sometimes on these surveying jobs to make some extra money and go survey certain regions for the government. But he just made some bad business decisions. There were some people that didn't pay him back when he loaned them money. There's a great book by an author named Darcy Janesh, and it's called Epic Wanderer. And that it talks about his whole life, but it recounts it's one of the books that talks about Thompson's later years pretty in depth. But he lived out those days in Montreal, eventually became pretty impoverished. But I think one of the reasons was because the Hudson's Bay Company didn't like how he left them. They weren't willing to, give him a pension or help him out or, give him any kind of credit. And he just kind of died in obscurity. He started to go blind in his later years. Probably, I've heard it speculated, probably because a lot of this taking coordinates and looking at these stars and writing all this down, he was doing all this by candlelight at nighttime, you know, with a little desk like out there in the wilderness, looking up and looking down at his computer, recording all this stuff. Like, he strained his eyes pretty tremendously doing all that work. A lot of his children lived with him in his later years. But yeah, when he died, he was in obscurity, and it wasn't until later on that people kind of started to bring him back as somebody of importance and talk about how, you know, amazing this journey was that he did. Another great local author I'd recommend is Jack Nisbet, who's in Washington. He's written a few awesome books about Thompson. He has one called Mapmaker's Eye, and it's more of like a larger format book with a lot of old drawings and maps in it and everything. He has one called Sources of the River that's a little more of a story, kind of where you like, he'll take you back to Thompson's time and then sort of bring you forward in time to that same place on the river and what it looks like today. And yeah, great books to check out if you want to learn more about David Thompson. Anybody else? Any items you're up here that you're curious about that you're kind of like, what is that thing? Or the way I'm dressed. The way I'm dressed is to kind of illustrate a man who would have been one of these laboring class people with Thompson, somebody who might have paddled a canoe or been one of these hunters, dressing part native, part European, with corduroy trousers were common. Leather leggings and leather moccasins were really common for men to wear because shoes and boots wore out. When you got shoes from the settlements, they only lasted so long, and once they wore out, it was hard to get a new pair. So a lot of times you just wore moccasins when you were out in the West.
How many have you played the deuce harp?
Oh, not well, but I have one here just as a. It was another obscure kind of trade good item that was on the lists. These things date way back hundreds of years. I guess just because they were kind of a fun little trinket and lightweight and easy to pack. A few of the other things like beaver castoreum, the scent glands of a beaver were saved by a trapper, and that was what they would use to draw a beaver into their trap, because beavers are very territorial and they mark their scent by making mud pies on the banks of the wetlands or rivers where they live, and then they deposit this scent from their backside on there. It has kind of a nice smell. It sort of reminds me of like cottonwood bud resin in the springtime when you smell that sticky red resin that comes off the cottonwood buds. And probably because they eat a lot of cottonwood and willow bark. And it's actually been used for centuries in Chinese medicine because it has a certain amount of salicylic acid in it, which is like aspirin, just like willow bark does. Other unique thing about this stuff was that at some point in history, people found that you could remove the beaver smell from it, and it was supposed to be a really good oil for holding fragrance. So they used to, and probably still do today, use it as a base for perfumes. Ladies' perfumes sometimes have refined beaver castoreum. But using that in combination with the iron trap became a very efficient way to trap beaver. Prior to that being done, the way that a lot of the Indian people acquired a beaver was you either go out and you hide out by a wetland and wait for a beaver to come by and shoot it with your bow, or they would sometimes go out on the ice when it was frozen up and they could go to the beaver's dam, use their ice pick to dig through the ice and put nets down blocking the entrances of the beaver's lodge, and then start tearing the lodge open until they got in there, and they would club the beavers and take them out. So what you can imagine, that would be a brutal amount of work to do and not always functional. So a trap was like way faster and easier, but they were expensive to acquire. I know we have a certain copy of ledgers from Spokane House that were kept in, I think it's the years 1824 to 25, and they have a valuation of some of the trade goods in the back of it. And they said in 1824-25 it was 6 dried beaver skins, like you see here, to purchase 1 trap like that. And if a trapper's lucky, they might be getting somewhere on the order of about 60 skins, and that would be a productive trapping season back then. So 6 of those skins was a pretty decent amount of your catch.
Shaun, could you comment on how they transported these skins?
Yeah, so
They're carrying a long distance.
it was really common to make all the incoming trade goods plus the outgoing furs up into 90-pound bales, because that was considered to be a good weight that you could put on either side of a pack saddle, because 180 pounds was roughly the weight of a man. And that weight was also what a man was supposed to carry on his back when they portaged the canoes around rapids. You had to put a tump line on, which was kind of like a big leather band with ropes going down that would attach to 2 of those bales on your back. And you would heft those across the portage, however long that distance was. Some of these portages, like Grand Portage over in Lake Superior, were 8 miles long. So you'd be carrying 180 pounds over that distance, putting it down, going back, getting another load, putting it down. Eventually the whole canoe comes over. It was an arduous task. And there were stories of some of these voyageurs dying from hernia, from lifting all this weight. There's some boastful stories of some guys saying they could carry 4 bales. I don't know if that's true or not.
Do you think you could say that he kind of, what terms of what he experienced, that he kind of made Lewis and Clark look like Boy Scouts?
I wouldn't quite say that, because I think Lewis and Clark were pretty epic in their own way of what they accomplished, and the fact that the only guy who died with them was appendicitis, I believe. They accomplished something equally pretty amazing, and the fact that they were able to do that trip without mostly not having any big warfare with any tribal people, with the exception of when they had the fight with some of these Piegan men up at Marias River and killed 2 of them. And they think that kind of set off some of the animosity early on between the Blackfeet Piegan and the trappers, and might have been sort of what started the bad relations. Thompson claimed that he thinks he was able to cross Howell's Pass that one year uninterrupted, because that happened in 1806, I believe, when Lewis and Clark had that fight and killed 2 Piegan men, and it was 1807 when Thompson crossed. And he speculated that he might have been uninterrupted by the Piegan in that trip, because all their braves had gone down to seek revenge on these travelers, Lewis and Clark. So I think both of them did some pretty amazing things in their journeys. It was just that Thompson was he was going through some different regions, and he was doing more of this repeated back and forth journeying of crossing the mountains, where it wasn't just one big expedition and come back. But Lewis and Clark were acquiring plant knowledge, all these specimens of plants and animal furs and these things kind of for scientists to study that they would bring back. Whereas Thompson was doing not as much of that, but mostly just recording data that he could assemble into this, map of the West, which he eventually did. He made this whole map that the original, I believe, hangs in a big library in Toronto behind glass today. But I had the good fortune of going to Fort William a couple summers ago, which is over on Thunder Bay in Ontario. And Fort William, if you ever get a chance to go there, it is amazing. It is almost like a Williamsburg sort of thing, where it's just a sprawling recreation of this fort that covers acres, where every building is built exactly like it would have been in the early 1800s. And inside the Great Hall, which was where the chief factor would have lived and held his dinners for the gentlemen and everything, they have a copy of Thompson's map, because originally that map, when it was finished by Thompson, it hung there in the Great Hall. So they have an artist actually recreated the whole thing in pencil, and still that recreation hangs there today.
And did Lewis and Clark access some of his journals?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, trying to remember what happened there. Thompson had, I believe they had some data from Thompson. They had something that Thompson had recorded when they did their trip. They had some information where Thompson had previously been down near the Mandan villages, and Lewis and Clark had obtained some of Thompson's information, like a map or some coordinates. There was also this weird thing where David Thompson had acquired some piece of information from Lewis and Clark by way of another person they think that Lewis and Clark had sent a letter to. So yeah, like really they knew about one another, and Lewis and Clark definitely made it out there and found the Columbia before Thompson, but they were aware of each other, and Thompson was trying to kind of reach this waterway of the Columbia and figure out this navigable route to the Pacific, and the Americans got there first. Mark, I don't think I fully answered your question though about furs. All the furs like you see here, a beaver fur like this would be dried on a hoop, because a hoop, and you can see a beaver is naturally very oval shaped. After it would be dried, it would be taken off that hoop, and then the fur folded into more of a square shape. So you can imagine folding like 4 of the sides in to make a large square. And they would stack those up and compress them. Out in the field, a bunch of trappers might compress them with a rude kind of pole log press that they made. But back at the forts, they often had these larger like mechanical screw presses. Or sometimes big cantilevers that would smash 60 or more furs down into a tight little bale that they would lash up and cover in canvas so that it could go back to England and not get damaged by bugs and weather. Because all of this stuff, if it gets wet, if wool moths get into it or hide beetles, it'll get back and be totally worthless. So you really had to protect the furs from damage like that.
How did they waterproof the tanks?
Yeah, it wasn't really waterproofed in any way. Because there's a lot of instances where canoes capsized or a horse fell over in a river and got washed downstream. And then Thompson talks about having to stop and open all that bale out and try to dry out all this tobacco or dry out a bunch of fabrics or whatever it was and put it back together. There were some tarps that they would have had in the canoe that were, they would coat them with linseed oil and red iron oxide, and that did make a pretty waterproof covering that if it was a heavy rainstorm, they could pull it over parts of the canoe to cover some of the cargo, or at a camp, they might cover the cargo with it, but they didn't actually wrap all the goods in that treated kind of canvas like that. Is there another question? Yeah.
Two kind of randomly separated questions, but one, you mentioned the Columbia went up into Canada and came back down. Was the Pend Oreille at that time called the Columbia, or is this?
No. So the Columbia, by Thompson, he was calling that the Columbia. He called the Kootenai River the McGilvery's River, I believe, and the Pend Oreille, he was calling that the which one was that? I think he was calling that the Skeet Shoe River or something. There were these different names that he was giving to things, some of these rivers, and so you have to kind of look through and figure out. I think he might even call it the Salish River. But he would give them names, sometimes based on the people that lived around it, or he would name it after, like McGilvery was one of the other fur company men back at Rocky Mountain House. So yeah, he became familiar with the Pend Oreille when he started making his way down into this region. He hired a guide to take him on the Pend Oreille River because he at first wanted to see if that would connect to the Columbia. And the guide said, well, yeah, it can, but there's some rapids out there. And he paid a man to take him. And they got the whole way out there to Meadowing Falls and where the Box Canyon Dam is. And it was just way too rugged. Just the rapids were too much. To get around the rapids would have been scrambling up these steep, rocky hillsides. And he just said, this isn't going to work. This isn't a navigable route for us. So yeah, he did attempt it, wanted to see if that was a possible route. But it wasn't until, I believe it wasn't until 1811, after they had done that trip down the Columbia, that he then started to figure out that this Columbia River must be that headwaters that we've been coming on to. And then they started paddling that the whole way back to where Kootenai House was. And became familiar that, this all connects together here. Any other questions?
Well, the other totally random one is, did Mom ever find out about what she had to give him up? Did she ever find out anything about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure if he definitely could have wrote, messages were going back and forth. I can't recall from all my reading, though, if there was correspondence between the two or how long she lived. I think there's probably some information out there, but yeah, it's a good question. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everybody coming out today.
I think we'll all agree we've had a master class this afternoon, so it's really been a wonderful experience. And thank you all for coming and listening. And the cookies, and I've got a hat for donations if you want to donate. Half of it will be split between the Historical Society and the church, who's providing this space for us. But thank you very much. Well, I'll stand over here. Come over this way. Oh, there's a donation.
How do you